Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bruce Dixon. I'm director of the Seeker Center for Asian Studies, and I'm happy to welcome you here, but also introduce today's speaker and the topic that she'll be working on. Jennifer Lind is a professor of government at Dartmouth, also a fellow at Chatham House in London and at the Reischauer Institute for Japanese Studies at Harvard. A student of the rise of major powers, as you may guess from the affiliation with the Reischauer Institute. The thought was that Japan was a rising power. Some of you were not born when that discussion died, but in the 80s and 90s, the fear was that Japan was going to rise and take over the United States, at least economically. Similar during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was a rising power and would eclipse the United States. What motivates this book is one of those similar debates and ideas that are emerging now about China. Are they valid, or are they perhaps dubious given previous predictions of what previous literature and scholarship on rising powers? So I won't give more than that away. So she'll speak for the usual 40-45 minutes, have a period of Q&A, but please join me in welcoming Jenny Lind.
Hey everyone, thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you for coming out. It's really wonderful to be here, and I'm especially grateful to the cohort that arranged the talk. This was a joint effort of Professor David Shambaugh. I was just reminded this morning there's multiple Shambaughs around here, and it turned out I was waiting outside the office of the other one. Dave Shambaugh actually used to teach thermist, so actually that would have been kind of nice to see. But so thank you to Professor Shambaugh, Professor Downs, and Professor Dixon for making this talk happen. As Bruce said, I began this book project as an international relations scholar, interested in to what extent China's rise would shift the balance of power and thus could challenge the United States geopolitically. And it may seem strange to some of you, but there was a time not that long ago when people were actually quite skeptical that China could rise to become a great power. There was also previous times, as Bruce mentioned, we were talking about Japan rising to overtake the United States, and then before that, the Soviet Union. So there's a long tradition of these kinds of debates. But anyway, over the years, China had rapidly gained many of the foundations of great power. So of course, it had a very large population, and it became one of the world's largest economies. And then it built a very large and capable military. The missing puzzle piece, though, was to what extent China could become an innovation leader, because great powers must become technological leaders. So again, my question started off as interested in how China's rise would transform the balance of power. But as slowly you started to see that happen, the big remaining puzzle piece was, can China become a technological leader? And here, there was also a great deal of skepticism. Many people were saying, this was about, 10, 15 years ago, that the gap between the US and China in terms of capabilities, so again, economic, military, technological capabilities, was so vast that China could not possibly close that gap. And I should add, a lot of those people are actually at Dartmouth in my department, which made for a lot of very spirited lunch table conversations. The second thing that a lot of people were saying is that China can't innovate because of, and then there were a variety of explanations that you heard here, and they called China as a copycat nation. And so, sure, China's really good at taking stuff that other people innovated and maybe making it more cheaply and faster and so on, but they can't do actual, new to the world innovation. So the argument went. And then another root of skepticism was related in this argument about authoritarianism and people saying, that in the modern era that we're in, when information is so important, in authoritarian countries are not going to be able to become technological leaders because of their domestic institutions. So the skeptics said institutions in authoritarian countries are inimical to the conditions that cause innovation. So before I go further, let me just briefly talk about how I conceptualize innovation. And essentially, I borrow definitions from some leading innovation scholars. So this is the discovery, introduction, or development of new technology. And then a key point here is the adaptation of technology to a new use or new environment. So a lot of people, I think, when we think of the word innovation, we tend to confuse it with invention. And invention is this never before existed, and I've created this new thing, right? This is different from the way the field, the innovation studies, talks about innovation. So again, it could be you have this technology, but you realize that it's useful in this other realm or for a different function, for a different market. So that's not new to the world, that's new to a new function or. And then a very distinguished scholar, Jeffrey Ding, who I'm thrilled is in the audience here today, he reminded us that there's another component to innovation particularly when we're talking about comparing nations and their competitiveness. There's a really important dimension of innovation, which is countries' ability to diffuse new technologies throughout their economies. And so it's not just congratulations, you've created this cool new thing, but to what extent can you actually diffuse that throughout the economy so that, for example, it is able to transfer to other new uses and new markets and so on. So again, diffusion is a really important component of innovation here. All right, so in the book, I draw on the innovation literature, and I note that scholars have identified several different conditions that are necessary to foster innovation. And so there's no magic recipe here. This is one of the most important questions in the world, which is what makes a given firm or a given organization, let alone a given country, more or less innovative, right? This is a massive question and it will remain a mystery until the end of time. So I don't have a magic formula to give you, but people have noted there are several conditions that are associated with and tend to encourage innovation. So here I talk about, for example, property rights, which is the first thing that most innovation scholars point to is really important. So again, to incentivize entrepreneurs and inventors to take the risk and pay all the costs of this activity, you need to grant that they will actually be able to benefit from that activity. And so that comes in the form of property rights. And then capital. Innovation requires a lot of capital, a lot of investment, right? From personnel, from materials, facilities. And then related to that is you need a country, it benefits from having a stable macroeconomic environment that encourages investment, right? So if your economy is inflationary and going like this, that's not conducive to capital investment. So stable macroeconomic conditions are very useful. You also need highly skilled human capital. So you need a highly skilled workforce, a well-trained workforce, scientists, scholars, and then also engineers are very important, particularly as Professor Ding pointed out, for diffusing the innovations throughout the economy. Political scientists also talk about the ease of reform, which is key for innovation, partly because when you think about it, innovation encourages a lot of change. We talk about Schumpeter had the definition of creative destruction, right? So innovation is creative destruction. So that means when some technology comes up, another thing, the previous way of doing things is destroyed. And so I just recently saw that movie Blackberry. Have you guys seen that? It's actually, it's a good film in general, but also there's this incredible moment where the company that's manufacturing the Blackberry there's the Steve Jobs holding up the iPhone moment, and the BlackBerry people just realize it's over. It's over, right? And that's just this stunning thing that happens with innovation. So you youngsters in the room aren't going to remember the Palm Pilot. Some of us remember the little pencils we used to use to write with the Palm Pilots. So again, what happened to the Palm Pilot? It got destroyed by BlackBerry. And then what happened to the BlackBerry? I won't spoil the ending for you. But the point I was making is, with all of this creative destruction, you need the workforce to be able to shift toward the new innovation. You need materials to be freed up from one sector and to be available in the next. Maybe this is a geographical thing. Labor force regulations are really important here. Other regulations are important. So societies that tend to be more nimble in terms of the red tape, right? So societies with lots of red tape are kind of choking innovation by inhibiting that kind of creative destruction. Okay. And then scholars also talk about networks. You can think of these as both domestic and also transnational, as being really important for innovation, for disseminating ideas, for trade, for cooperation among scientists. So like here, we have the benefit of amazing domestic networks. And so if I want to learn about China, I draw on a network and I go talk to David, where do you go? David Shambaugh. I go talk to Bruce Dixon. I go talk to your amazing people at Elliott, at Georgetown, right? So that's a domestic network. In the US, we're really lucky it's been an international one as well, because we have the ability to attract talent. And then I also want to go talk to people in Asia about my book, right? So all of this is supposed to strengthen the quality of the work. And so it's a combination here of the networks and also an openness that people have that ability to go, to in search of these networks to make their work better. So these are the conditions necessary for these different aspects of innovation. There's a powerful conventional wisdom, as I said, that authoritarian regimes are not good at providing those conditions, right? So this, again, we think, gosh, they're not very good about respecting property rights. We think of dictators that tend to expropriate. They just kind of confiscate people's ownership, and so that's going to deter innovation. They're notoriously high consumption regimes because they need a lot of money. It turns out you need a lot of money to be a dictator. And so you consume a lot, which is inflationary and bad for capital investment. It also means when you're spending money, you're not spending it on research and development, for example, or education. Autocrats are also, they tend to appoint cronies to the civil service, right? So these kind of patronage jobs are really an important part of keeping your loyalists happy, right? Jobs in the civil service tend to be a really important dimension of that. And so that's a problem because we wanted a solid civil service to administer education policy and so on. Autocrats also rely heavily on repression, which inhibits creativity and risk-taking that innovation requires. They prohibit civil society, which we talk about as like private sector, media, universities, and so on. And so this obviously suppresses that network dimension, which reduces information flows and the dissemination of ideas. So skeptics, in short, argue that authoritarians, both because of because of the nature of their institutions, are just not going to be able to provide these conditions, which are really important for fostering innovation. And then this general skepticism about authoritarian rule rests on a Nobel Prize winning economics literature. So that literature talked about the institutions that authoritarians rely upon to stay in power calling them extractive institutions, and saying that extractive institutions are really inimical to economic growth. And that literature specifically predicted that China's rise would therefore come to an end, that Chinese growth would hit a ceiling because the country would be incapable of providing the conditions that innovation requires. Political scientist Samuel Huntington summed this up by describing what he called the king's dilemma, harkens to the dictator's dilemma. The king's dilemma is said that autocrats have this dilemma between, on the one hand, they need to control, they need to stay in power, and so exert various controls on their society. But on the other hand, when you do control, that tends to suppress the forces for economic growth and innovation. So on the one hand, you could say, all right, I'm going to have very, very tight control because I want to stay in power. But again, the dilemma of that is then inhibiting growth. As we know from studying international relations, this is a very competitive world. And if you make your economy into a basket case, that's not good for your national capabilities and sometimes for your national survival. So if you're an authoritarian, you're kind of stuck between the need to stay in power versus the need to cultivate economic growth and remain globally competitive. All right. In my book, I make two key arguments. I show empirically that China has become a highly innovative country, joining the ranks of the world's technological leaders. And I argue that China's government did this through what I call smart authoritarianism. In other words, they found a way around the king's dilemma. So I argue there's indeed a tension between the authoritarian regime's need to control versus the need to allow flows of people and information. But that tension is not nearly as deep or as insurmountable as many people thought. So in the book, I begin with empirics that show that China has become an innovation leader. And this is a relatively recent occurrence. It was really happening while I was researching the book. And every year I would update the data and see the graphs moving a little bit higher. I'm just going to show you a few graphs today because I don't want to blind you with all of the charts here. There's kind of two types that I'm going to show you. So one is what we consider innovation inputs, which are the kinds of things that if you put these into your economy, that's generally associated with producing more innovation. And then another set is innovation outputs, which is capturing the actual innovation. So let me start with an input. And here we're looking at research and development spending as a percentage of GDP. And so again, you see a real change over time in between looking at the year 2000 versus the year 2021, where China just kind of wasn't in the same league as these countries before, and now it very much is. And then if you translate this into actual aggregate spending, I believe it's second in the world next to the United States. So it's very much because again, China's GDP is so large that 3% of that or 2.5% of that or whatever is a lot of money. Another input is measuring the number of PhDs that you're producing in the science and technology fields. So again, we see China is now actually has overtaken the United States and is producing the most of any world. So now to outputs. This is a chart about patents. It turns out patents are a really tricky and fraught thing to measure, which I did not know when I first studied this, and I learned the hard way. So there's all sorts of different databases of different patents that you could use, and some of them that have been in the media that you can look at basically show a line like this, and China's ahead of everybody else. That one, for various reasons, I and other scholars think kind of overstates Chinese innovation. And so I went in the other direction here, which I looked at kind of the most conservative measurement of Chinese patenting. This is what's called triadic patents, which is a technology has to be approved for a patent in the US, the EU, and in Japan, and those 3 patent offices. And so essentially, it's a pretty high bar, as you can imagine. It's also, it takes a long time for it to be approved, and it's a rather expensive process. And so for all those reasons, the firms that tend to apply for these are the largest firms, the big companies, the Huawei's, the Tencents. And so that tends to not reflect the small and medium enterprises in China. So this is actually leaving out a lot of Chinese innovation. So again, I grappled with what do I show? Do I show the really overheated one that I think is not the highest quality? Do I show the super conservative one? And I said, you know what? I'm going to show them this one because China does really well even on this one, right? You see a really significant change over the time period that we're looking at here. Data visualization when it comes to innovation is a tricky thing. I just wanted to draw attention because the countries that we're looking at here are really the handful of the world's high performers. And so just imagine the legions of countries that are not on this chart that would not even register, right? So that's with all of these charts, there's this dilemma of how to remember this. And so it really is quite an extraordinary thing that China rose from those ranks, and so now is kind of has taken the lead over countries that we really think of as being among the world's most innovative. There's the US and Japan up here, which are kind of in their own stratosphere, which is itself a really interesting story. But I think, again, a really fascinating change has been China's ability to move into and even above this group of highly innovative countries. All right. And then I have, this is research articles. So basic research, journal articles. Here, there's all sorts of problems too in terms of measuring this. So based on the various problems and pitfalls of using this measurement, the one I chose is to adjust for citations. So this isn't just however many articles just counted up. This is capturing how often are they actually cited, which is a metric for how much has this work actually changed things, how much are people noticing this work, building on this work, et cetera. So here we also see that China has moved up into these ranks. Another really interesting thing, just kind of that comes across these charts, is to see where some nations do better or worse, right? So the UK is just, they're really performing well on this dimension. And when you looked at patenting, Japan was performing really, really well, right? So it really is kind of interesting to see the different ways in which countries are performing differently. But again, the point here is to show that Japan is once again in this group. It's moved into this group over time. And then lastly, this was an indicator that is trying to capture more of the diffusion end. So the patenting, for example, does a good job capturing the invention end. And then I mentioned, though, it's important to capture to what extent are these innovations actually successfully diffusing through the society. So one way of doing that is to look at are these things actually commercialized? Are they commercializing advanced technology? And so here again, we see China as a high technology export leader. So high technology exports specifically as a percentage of all manufactured exports. Okay, so it's all of those charts are starting to lead to a shift in the narrative about China. And we're starting to see these headlines these days, right? So when I started the project, there was an article that I cited a lot, was Why China Can't Innovate in Harvard Business Review. And then Harvard Business Review ran an article about 8 years later, The Secret Behind China's Innovation. So it's like, okay, they figured something out along those lines. So anyway, here's what we have now, right? Like every time we pick up a newspaper or the equivalent, there's a picture of a Chinese robot, right? Like what was it done lately? So I guess they just ran the fastest marathon in
Half marathon.
human history. What do we call that?
Half marathon.
Okay, half, all right, half. This is clearly not in human history, so faster than a human. So anyway, so the robots are up to a lot these days. I don't know what the nationality of the Polish robot chasing the boar was, but that was. Why are there boars? Warsaw, by the way. Did anyone have that? Okay, sorry, that's so these are the headlines that we're seeing these days. And this raises a key puzzle. So we thought that China's regime faced this dilemma, right? Faced this inexorable dilemma. And so how was this authoritarian regime able to foster cutting edge innovation? So I argue that one of the lessons that we see from China, as well as these other, these smart authoritarians, as I call it, is that the king's dilemma positioned things in very static terms. In fact, autocrats adapted to the information age in which they found themselves. So again, following a model that I call smart authoritarianism, China has blended a novel approach to political control with selective economic openness. And it's built this model by following examples of previously what were called the developmental dictators in East Asia, such as Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew, South Korea under Park Chung-hee, and others. Again, those were countries that attracted a great deal of attention because even though they were autocracies, they were able to lift their societies up to the middle income level, which was really extraordinary. We didn't think they could do that. And so it attracted a lot of scholarly attention. And then, however, South Korea democratized, Taiwan also liberalized. The only outlier was Singapore. And nobody thought Singapore could be a model for China to follow, right? I mean, it's hard to think of two more different countries in terms of population, size, right? This is very, very, I mean, basically, people don't think Singapore can be a model for any other country because it's so strange in that way. It's such a unique country. But China's smart authoritarianism actually shows its leaders learned a great deal from Singapore. Singapore actually, Lee Kuan Yew actually went to China many times to advise on economic development. Chinese leaders came to Singapore to study their model and so on. And so it was not just indirectly observing, it was actually studying at the knee of the master kind of a thing. All right. So essentially, I argue that Chinese leaders did provide those conditions to foster innovation. And the way they did that, again, was by adapting their tools of control. So scholars of authoritarian and Chinese politics have shown that there are all these different mechanisms through which this is evident. So sorry, there's a lot here. This is for all you authoritarian politics literature nerds out there. So for the first condition I mentioned was property rights, right? And so conventional wisdom had been very pessimistic about that. But scholars have found that authoritarian leaders improved property rights and then also improved the judiciary, which is essential for basically allowing people to negotiate and litigate property rights. And so again, people have been very pessimistic about people's ability to do this in authoritarian regimes, but the more developmentally minded authoritarians and then later China allowed this. Education is a public good. And so there's a literature on developmental dictators providing public goods and learning to do this, and this being a really important part of the development story. So this is rooted in the East Asian development cases, and the providing capital, encouraging inward FDI, providing stable macroeconomic conditions to encourage all that was a vital part of that story in China also. There's also, in the authoritarian politics literature, there's all this study on the shift from high intensity repression to low intensity repression. And so those of you who are familiar with the kind of extraordinary changes in authoritarian politics over the last 50 or so years, we now talk about competitive authoritarianism and electoral authoritarianism, and there's all these different words for the similar phenomenon in countries like Hungary, until a very interesting election just last week, which is very exciting. And so scholars have pointed out the interesting ways in which authoritarian regimes are relying on different tools of repression that I argue are more favorable, more conducive for economic growth, as well as staying in power. There's also a level of openness that we had not associated with authoritarian regimes. I mean, obviously, we saw this to a great extent in China. So allowing the mobility of people for trade and tourism, students going overseas, and so on. And then also government-controlled civil society and information flows. This, again, people in liberal countries such as ours are very skeptical when we hear of government-controlled civil societies. We think, oh, well, it's still government control. But it turns out that allowing universities to operate, even under your own parameters, having private media, even under the universities, the regime's parameters and so on, you still get a lot of beneficial effects from that. And so having that civil society is a really important factor. Civil society scholars have also linked to ease of reform. So countries with stronger civil societies are better able to reform. So that gets us to that dimension. I should note that a lot of this I gleaned from the authoritarian politics literature. And there, one of the key dependent variables of interest, like one of the key questions that literature is interested in, it tends to be regime longevity, or how long does the regime stay in power? And so it's arguments like if you use low intensity repression, you're still able to stay in power as long or longer, for example, these kinds of findings. And so essentially where I see my book fitting in is I have a different question. I have a different dependent variable, which is innovation and long-term economic growth. And so essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying all of these tools that you all found increase the durability of the regime, the longevity of the regime, they also promote economic growth and are good for innovation. So that's kind of how my book joins that literature. I was just interested in a different question. Okay. All right, let me make a couple points about smart authoritarianism. So first of all, it's not a growth maximizing strategy. So remember, you're trying to do two things. You're trying to stay in power, so you need to maintain some control, and you're trying to foster economic growth. And so you always are going to have that element of control, which will leave some growth on the table, right? So if you didn't have that, and so liberal societies don't have that constraint. If you didn't have that, you would have been able to grow more. So it's not about maximizing economic growth. Importantly, I should note, democracies have other trade-offs. Democracies have other dilemmas of their own that they have to figure out. And I think that was actually an important thing that was left out of these scholarly debates, because we tended to ask, here are authoritarian countries with all of their flaws and dilemmas, and here's democracies. And democracies do better. Right, and so we didn't say, well, what are the problems associated in democracies that might actually hold us back? So I think the comparison needed to be more complete. The second point I want to say is this is also a dynamic model. The model predicts adjustment, constant adjustment. So again, the argument is you're balancing control and economic growth. And so essentially, we'd expect that leaders will tighten up at some points and loosen at other points based on how secure they feel about the general public and their perceptions of the regime. And then it could be based on a whole lot of other things, like perhaps the technologies available to them, technologies of control, for example. It could be based on trends in the global economy. So it's a difficult model to get right, because again, you are trying to balance these two very important things in a constantly changing world. So it's a challenging model. And as I'm saying, it's a very dynamic one. A few years ago, Xi Jinping imposed some really tight controls on the technology sector. And a lot of my friends at Dartmouth said, oh, he's so stupid. Like, why is he doing that? Doesn't he know that that's bad for growth? I mean, my first reaction is, I think he probably knows China's economy better than you do. Basically, he knows it's bad for growth, right? That's not the point. He's got another goal, which is control, right? And so the prediction is, at times you will see the regime doing things that are bad for growth if they believe it's good for control. All right. So smart authoritarianism is essentially always looking for that kind of sweet spot between freedom and control. And again, that spot is going to be constantly changing due to economic trends, societal trends, and also trends in technology. So my findings are that China's smart authoritarian governance, and we can also talk about combined with its heavy investment in innovation, state-led investment in innovation, has yielded tremendous technological success, enabling it to become a technological leader and indeed a superpower that has transformed the global balance of power. And I argue that China's government achieved this through smart authoritarianism. Its success and the spread of this model, we see the smart authoritarian model spreading to countries like Vietnam and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Morocco. The spread suggests greater optimism about autocracy's ability to grow past that middle income stage, where again, this Nobel Prize winning literature told us they could not go further than that. And then also, this, of course, in China's case, has dramatic implications for the global balance of power. Now, a key question that we have at this time is, how sustainable a model is this? So can this continue? I just told you how difficult it was to get it right. And there's indeed some really important skeptical arguments out there. And China does face some really important economic challenges. The country's struggling to manage numerous problems, such as adverse demographics and high levels of debt, troubled property sector, and no one knows how effectively the CCP is going to manage those and other problems, or the effect that those will have on the economy's growth. More optimistically, other scholars point to the fact the CCP has actually navigated some other really serious challenges in the past and has also learned a great deal from them. So regardless of its future, though, China's authoritarian government did something that few observers thought was possible: for an authoritarian country to become a technological leader and a superpower. And this has enabled it to become a far more formidable great power than many people expected. And also this has key implications for the United States and its partners who care about the character of the global economic system, the global political system, and about the spread of democracy versus authoritarianism worldwide. And as we have already seen, China's superpower rise has powerful implications for US national security policy all over the world. So I will stop there and I look forward to your questions.
Before we open it to questions, I skipped over something in my intro, that this event is being co-sponsored by the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies under the able smart authoritarian leadership of Tom Downs here in the middle of the room. Let me ask you a question, sort of where you end up. So in that slide that had the factors that the criteria, the model for smart authoritarianism, there seems to be less of many of those things in China today than they were in the Deng Xiaoping era. That was really your focus in the book. There's more repression, there's less space for civil society, tighter controls over flow of information, and so on. So at what point does a country shift from smart authoritarianism to just generic authoritarianism?
Yeah, so this is a great question because again, we're talking about a country that had behaved as a traditional authoritarianism or however you want to call it. My students say dumb authoritarianism, but I don't should say that. So under Mao, for example, we saw very severe repression, like public dramatic repression, not a whole lot of investment in R&D, human capital. Actually, over time, human capital and health investment improved. But so basically, the argument is China going like this, right? Like, so has it passed its peak essentially in terms of, did it previously provide these conditions and it's no longer doing that? And so I mean, there's a more skeptical view out there that says, lots of it is associated with Xi Jinping and saying Xi Jinping came into power and then he started unwinding some of these things that led to more of this open civil society and freer media conditions, greater openness with the rest of the world, and so on. And now that's contracting. So I guess I think we are seeing, when we look at some of those dimensions like civil society, we have seen changes. But then the question is I guess we would need a finer model to understand the weighting of those. So for example, their R&D spending is still growing, right? So that one is going up, right? The workforce is going up, the high-tech workforce is going up. So there's some things that are doing really well and even growing stronger. There's other dimensions like the openness is down partly because of us, right? Like China enjoyed basically like all of this access to the US scientific establishment for many years. And right now, a lot of US leaders are really unhappy about that. And we've seen under the Trump administration tighter restrictions. And so that's not a China policy, that's a US policy. I guess one case that's really interesting to me that we can look at is a sector that did not exist prior to the Xi Jinping years, which is AI. So that sector did not exist. And the technology started maturing and becoming commercialized under Xi Jinping's government. And so what that tells us is, here's one area. I mean, maybe there were other areas where Xi's repression actually kind of stifled some technologies. But in at least one of the most important technologies for the next several decades, at least, what we call a general purpose technology that has the potential to transform every sector that it touches. In other words, Professor James' book talks about this. This was a technology that China was able to really run with, right? And is now vying with the United States for leadership in this. And so it's clear that even in this era in which some of these dimensions, some of these conditions are less conducive to innovation, you would say. Clearly, there's other things that are at work that are allowing China to remain really innovative.
I'll let you field your questions, but as she calls on you, please say who you are so both Jenny and the rest of us know who's asking the question. So
Okay,
go for it.
okay, you're right here.
Kimberly Morgan, I'm in the political science department and also here in the Elliott School. I was interested by the fact that you have not yet said anything about the Communist Party. And I'm just wondering about the role of the Chinese Communist Party, both on the control side and also on the innovation side, as an apparatus that has a distinctive, capacity for control that I think other authoritarian leaders might wish they had. And so that's kind of distinctive to the Chinese case, but then also we can think about its role in marshaling investment and setting targets for growth in particular regions and all the ways in which the party seems to have helped engineer at least some of the innovation. I don't know how much, and maybe you want to weigh in on that, but it just seems like that makes the Chinese case pretty distinctive compared to others, except arguably like Vietnam, right? And so I'm just wondering, from the standpoint of your argument, what role that party plays in your argument, and then implications for kind of scope conditions on where your argument would travel to.
Yeah, this is a great question. And it could end up being a really vital part of the story, especially as we're talking about resilience of the model over time and this kind of a thing. It's just a level of nuance that I didn't get into. Because again, I was interested in the kind of national competitiveness. And so I was looking at what are I wasn't looking at policy decisions per se. I was looking at the outcome of those decisions, right? So when I had those metrics the R&D, okay, China's government decides it's going to increase its R&D spending. And so there might have been a really interesting story in here in which maybe there was a party versus a leader dimension, and something really interesting went on that produced that. But it's just not an element that I got into. The politics of these decisions, which I can only imagine are unbelievably fascinating. That's not a level of nuance that I got into. But again, it's a fascinating question, particularly if you can identify. I think it's a really fruitful area to go into to look at both the Xi Jinping. Because everybody is talking about how he's more in control and more centralized control, but what is the rest of the party urging for or pushing for or not letting him do? Then there's also the provincial level and the local levels, and so there is just a absolutely fascinating story here to look at that I just don't get into in the book. Over here. Yeah.
Steve Jackson. I'm a lecturer here at the Seeker Center. I was wondering, one of the big, kind of planned innovations was China 2025, announced in 2015. And they had a number of different things that they said they were going to go do. And I can remember one that I studied in particular were autonomous ships. And by all appearances, they've done nothing in that. How many of those planned, areas were successful? How many of those planned areas were not successful? And how many innovations occurred completely outside of that framework?
Yeah, so this is a great question. My understanding is they did pretty well. They didn't get all of them, but they did pretty well. Is sort of when people like go sector by sector and they analyze, what was the effect of that plan. Again, they keep coming up with all these different plans and changing the names of things, and so it makes it a little challenging to study. But and then there was another dimension of that. But I would say again, I didn't look at. I can't see you. I didn't look at their plans as they laid them out so much. I kind of said, what is my measurement of successful national innovation? And I called that from the innovation literature, essentially, in terms of following how the National Science Board and other information scholars assess and compare national innovation. And so that's the method I use rather than the internal Chinese one. But there are a few different takes out there that I've looked at in terms of like how did they fare? And my understanding is kind of as we would expect, succeeded brilliantly on some duds in the other. Autonomous ships is an interesting one. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. I know US is working on that, Andrew. Thank you. Yeah.
My name's Anupam Khanna. I used to work at the World Bank. I was in China in the 80s and besides that decade, and then again in the late 90s, 2000, when I was chief of staff for Stiglitz in the bank. So I congratulate you on a very good book, at least whatever I heard, because it's somewhat more down to earth and capturing the essence of a lot of stuff that I've read, at least on the economic side of this. Couple of theoretical questions, which are actually very practical in implication. You mentioned one of the things is that the role of authoritarianism and its performance vis-a-vis growth. But if instead of using GDP growth, and not just me, the World Bank, if you have any reasonable metric of inclusive growth, which is, a la Atkinson or anybody like that, where you take into account equity, then I would say the Chinese actually have performed better than most countries. The usual argument that I faced in the bank elsewhere and in India, where I originally come from, is that, oh, no, but Chinese inequality has increased, but they're mixing up inequality of different types. China is a poor country with unequal, you look at the structure of the economy and what you're at, and you need to compare, geographically, the cost of living, etc. And I think the picture changes dramatically. So that's the one theoretical point. And I think your argument will actually be much stronger if you come up with that. Other type of thing is same thing with smart authoritarianism and vis-a-vis Asimoglu and Johnson. If you think they talk about extractive inclusive institutions, actually I would argue that Xi Jinping's, and I followed him on a journalistic basis, only what I can get from the media, I don't work on China anymore, is addressing the inclusive institutions part. Because if you think what he has been criticized for three things: prosperity, one, and then the control of the big, the Alibabas, etc. That was the big argument made. But isn't that what we want people, what we want in this country? Control of the big tech behemoths who basically distorted the economy. And that was what he did. If you look at Professor Chang Sheh's work, he will tell you that actually the vitality of the broad-based economic sector in China has actually increased over that period. So it is not, and on prosperity, he's actually talking about equity. And third, and again, interregional equity. And this goes back to pre-Hu Jintao era. And so I'm going too long, but
thank you. So the point about what are the outcomes we're interested, what are the economic outcomes we're interested in, it is a great one to keep reminding ourselves, because different communities are interested in different kinds of outcomes. And there's all sorts of people who criticize GDP as you could be doing like fairly useless things in your economy, but yet it counts as GDP, like digging up a hole and then filling it back up. It's like, that's GDP, right? And so there's all sorts of different indices that talk about, they try and bring in more inclusivity, equity, sort of like the desirable quality of life in the country and that sort of a thing. And so there are all of these different ways in which we might be interested in economic progress, I guess is the way to talk about it. I guess as an IR person, we're kind of at the other extreme, which is, but like, we want to know how much a country, like a regime, can kind of wring out of its country and then pour into its military, right? Even if it comes at the expense of like a vast swath of the country, or even if it comes at, you know, like lower quality of life for people, right? Because we're interested in this bluntly, like national competitiveness, and what can you mobilize that you can then use against another country, right? So that's the ultimately the IR security goal, right? And so if you said, you know, I mean, there's great questions about this, actually, really interesting questions, both with India and China. So China has just a vast swath of its country is not part of this story, right? So China has achieved all of this with just a little strip of its country, right? And so that's an unbelievable thing to contemplate, because option one is, oh my gosh, what if they bring in the rest of it, right? Which, I mean, America, we're just done. Or the other answer is, if they're unable to bring the rest of it in, and that drags everybody else down, right? So, but that's the key puzzle, and which is, if you have some big hinterland, is that good, bad, or neutral, right? Good because you might be able to bring it in later. Bad because it might drag the growth down the end, or neutral as in you can just do that. And as long as you have the rest of the country fueling growth, you're okay, right? So this is a really interesting question. And essentially what we see historically, which does not mean this is the truth going forward, but what we see historically is countries can really deprive the people. So we know the Chinese people this has been their story throughout history. The Russian people, this has been their story throughout history, of just tremendous deprivation while the government was in pursuit of other goals. And so that's a pretty interesting thing to know about those two countries. So anyway, that's on your first question of the equity. Should we be measuring that in other terms? And so yeah, I'm giving you the very cynical IR security answer, which is, you don't care, right? Which is, it's just, can you mobilize that national power, even if it comes at the deprivation of the people? But
Can I just say,
we're not supposed to talk like that, right? Like, we're not supposed to be like, that's our goal. And yeah, we should just understand that some countries, it is still their goal. Just one more point on your question, and then we should take somebody else. I think you raise a great point about the crackdown on big tech, because a lot of the ways this was represented in the West was Xi Jinping attacking his golden goose, right? Here's this amazing, productive, innovative sector, and Xi Jinping is just going after it for no reason. The more you learn about that case study, as you're pointing out, the more it starts to look like just how we're wrestling with big tech, and how some firms have so much power in the economy, and how do we feel about that? And shouldn't they be more regulated? And wait a minute, now you want to be a bank, right? What does that imply for national financial stability, right? So that was a really interesting case. Again, that it looks as if it's less this kind of predatory government and more of a government that's trying to regulate, at least on many dimensions. Yeah. David, go ahead.
Well, I'm interested, Jenny, in I'll grant that China is a innovation superpower in the world. On that metric, it definitely is a superpower. You've persuaded me in the book and otherwise, but does that really make China a superpower? There are various dimensions of power, at least 5 or 6: political, economic, technological, military, soft, and diplomatic power. So I was one of those skeptics you referred to at the beginning. 2014, I published a book called China, the Partial Power. 2017, I published another book, China's Future, in which I brought into the whole Acemoglu Robinson argument about the middle income trap, how they'll never get there on the innovation front now. They've proven me wrong. China's proven us all wrong. But I'm still skeptical. China may be a technological innovation superpower, but does that mean it's a military superpower? You know, they couldn't land a brigade 1,500 miles from their border, much less do what the United States has been doing in Iran recently. They don't have much soft power. Although their technology is, in fact, this innovation is an interesting part of soft power. You know, diplomatic power, you know, China's not setting the global diplomatic agenda. Commercial power depends how you define it. So I still see China as a glass half full, half empty, partial power, despite all these achievements in the innovation. So my question for you is, do you think there will be any kind of carryover from the innovation piece to these other 5 elements of China's comprehensive?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this just comes down to terminology, right? I wrote an article on it was actually part of the book for a while, and I tabbed it off of the book, but basically on measuring great power, measuring polarity. How do you approximate great power? And so scholars we're completely divided on what it means to be a great power, right? We have no accepted definition of that, let alone superpower, right? So what is a great power? We don't agree on what that is. What is a superpower? We don't agree on what that is. So any conversation about, is China a great power or a superpower, is this going to be sort of a circular thing about, like, do we have the same definition of great power and superpower, right? And so for example, you named a lot of things that like I wouldn't put in a discussion or a definition of a great power, right? So some of them are behavioral, right? And so I would say you should look at just kind of capabilities, and then what they do with those capabilities is kind of up to them. So at the barest level, like we look at latent power, which is really interesting, because then you see the could have been great powers that chose not to be, right? So Japan and Germany after World War II are both latent powers. So that we can agree on. They made the choice, we're not going to go down the great power or superpower route. And so then you can say, well, who did decide to become a great power, and so on. So I think that I think, David, you're getting at kind of a broader category of, like, a broader discussion of influence in the world economy, influence in international politics. And that's a really important thing. I mean, I would say we've seen China's influence on all those dimensions really grow since your book came out. So where had it been partial, it's getting more full. For me, when I think about great power and superpower, again, I come from the IR security literature, where like we talk about the Soviet Union was a superpower. There was the 2 superpowers in the Cold War, and the Soviet Union had just nothing approaching China's capability, right? And that's the really sobering thing. Is the Soviet Union never had 40% of the US economy. And depending on how you measure it, China's at about 100% or 120%. We've never had a country like that. Military power, they don't have to be able to project power all around the world. The Soviet Union couldn't do that. Like the question would be, can they achieve regional dominance in Asia and be a rival regional hegemon for the United States? That itself is world changing. And so again, it's my, looking back to the Soviet Union and saying, everybody said the Soviet Union was a superpower. We're certainly dealing with a superpower with China today. But again, it's wise to remember, like maybe we were wrong in calling the Soviet Union a superpower, and we should actually have a better accounting of Do we honestly think that that was a superpower, or were we just getting a little ahead of ourselves? But it's certainly shaped perceptions of China today. And again, I would say the only dimension that we see China lagging the Soviet Union is spending in terms of the military. The Soviets were spending, because their economy was so small, they had to really max out defense spending, and we're spending at like 18-20% of GDP, which is, as we see, completely unsustainable. China's spending 2%. Imagine if they were really trying, right? I mean, again, the size of this economy is so massive. So, I'm all for continuing the discussion of these words again, but in terms of when I look at it, the basic question is it a major geopolitical challenger to the US? I think it's so much more so than the Soviet Union. Alex.
Great, thank you. I'm Alex Downs, professor of political science at International Affairs and benevolent despot of the Institute of Security and Health.
No one calls you benevolent.
It's great to have you here. We're proud to have it in our series for the studies of security affairs students. I want to ask you about, it's kind of a regime type related question. So you said smart authoritarianism isn't a growth maximization strategy, but Chinese growth was spectacular, as was a lot of the other developing authoritarian states. So are you saying that if they had been more democratic, their growth rates would have been higher? Related to that, I can't quite make out what you're saying about democracy's growth. So there's the Nobel Prize winning view, right? The democratic optimists. Were they right? It's just that they were wrong about autocracies and that they were all one type. There's actually different kinds, and once you subdivide them up, some are capable of this, others are not. It's basically where the varieties of authoritarianism literature has gone. So democracy is the baseline. They're all good. Some authoritarians, depending on their institutions, can match that. Or were they wrong about democracies too? Right? Is it that the same factors explain growth and innovation across different regime types? And so you can have those institutions in democracies and autocracies? Or is it just that democracies are all good and just some authorities?
Yeah, so these are great, really fundamental questions. And I think essentially where I come down is just saying that regime type is not a very helpful lens. Like it's tripped us up. What I'm finding is, and again, back to the developmental dictators literature, developmental authoritarianism literature, which tried to make sense of the rapid growing East Asian miracle economies. Essentially, what that literature was reacting to was, wait a minute, we didn't think authoritarians could generate growth. How'd they do this? And essentially, it comes down to what are the economic policies that the government is following? Because we see a lot of democracies that follow not very enlightened economic policies, right? Like the story in Europe these days is kind of excessive regulation choking off innovation, right? And so those are democratic societies. So regime type, again, is not a particularly helpful lens for understanding what's going wrong in Europe and maybe right in the US. I can't imagine anyone having that conversation these days, but people talk about in the US, we face less onerous regulatory system, more pro-innovation regulatory system related to Europe. So again, the policy that we're interested in isn't really apropos of regime type at all. It's what's the economic policy. And so there have been a lot of economists who have been making this argument for a while. So in response, for example, to the institutions literature in development economics, which got very prominent, they were saying it's not necessarily institutions, it's policy. So show me the set of policies and I'll show you a country that's either going to generate growth or not, right? And so I think that's a better way for looking both at authoritarian countries and democracies to understand if they're aimed at economic growth. Yeah, and then in terms of what I'm finding, I guess with respect to the institution literature, I guess I'm saying they thought autocracies would have this big, there would be all of these obstacles to innovation in authoritarian countries. And so they'd be really broken and really dysfunctional. And I guess I'm finding they're not as bad at this as you thought. I'm not saying they're better at this, right? So that's the big difference here. This is not kind of an authoritarian triumphalism story and, oh, democracies are actually disadvantaged. They're not as bad as we thought. And that's bad enough, right? Because they're pretty good. And so there is a whole other story here that I'm not ready to sign on to, which is the kind of authoritarian triumphalism. And it could be, it might be different by sector, right? So there's a really interesting paper, Beijing at Harvard, there's an NBER paper, there's several different co-authors, where they, the name is like AI-tocracy. Yeah, AI-tocracy, where they say that countries that use AI in their kind of control technologies are going to have an advantage because they'll have all of this data that then can be used to bolster a commercial AI sector. And so this is an argument specifically about authoritarian advantage, right? So the more data that you have, the fewer privacy rights and so on, that, according to this view, that translates to commercial advantage because your firms can just kind of hoover it all up and use that for their own research. It's a really interesting argument. And we do know, like Professor Ding has taught us, that over the various centuries, we go through different epochs of technology change, and we are entering what's being called like the fourth industrial revolution with AI, this new general purpose technology. And so it is possible that we are going into this era of technological change that differently advantages democracies and autocracies. Perhaps. I'm not ready to go there yet. Partly because, again, it's very early days. Partly because, as I said, is regime type even the most useful lens we have for looking at this? And also, I don't know, I haven't given up on democracy yet. I think we do a lot right, particularly in the US. We do a lot right. We attracted all you amazing people here. We did something right. So I'm hesitant. I'm not willing to say there's an actual authoritarian advantage, but that is something that we have to think of as the technology does continue to change. We need to ask ourselves, maybe it'll end up actually being a democratic advantage like the information age was for a while. But then the key thing that we should always expect is adaptation, because that was the big story here. Glasses here.
Hi, I'm John Geyer. I'm an MA. I'm an MA Asian Studies student at Yale School. I go to Sunshine in Taiwan. And I thank you for your fantastic talk. And I was really interested that you mentioned how China was studying the economies of Singapore and South Korea. I didn't know that, so that's really cool. So I wanted to ask if China still has the capability or the wish to reform its economic system. And an example I have is like if it sees American AI companies are doing really great because they have no regulations. That's really cool. Is China still watching the economies of the rest of the world? And does it have the ability to go like, oh, okay, that's cool, let's change that? Or is it like, with Xi Jinping, is it really just like set in its ways?
That's a terrific question. I really like that question because again, what we learn is as economies mature, they tend to get a little more set in their ways, and there are these entrenched interests, and adaptation becomes harder, and kind of a Mansur Olson argument, right, about they get more sclerotic and this sort of a thing. And so that doesn't suggest they're combing the world looking for good ideas and how can we be better at this and this kind of a thing. I guess I would just say there's two different schools out there, and I don't know the answer to this. I think it's a really interesting question, though. Are you looking for a thesis question? Because I think you might have just found one. I don't know. That sounds pretty good. So it would be is the regime, so the view of Xi Jinping as preoccupied with control of kind of reform slowing, right? So that would say they're not doing this kind of a thing. And so you would be looking for evidence on that dimension, as opposed to the view that says they're going out, they're learning. I mean, one thing we do know is until recently, the Chinese Communist Party was sending people, including to probably here. Did you have a lot of people from from China, like doing executive education classes and this sort of thing here? Nick, did you ever teach any of those? Because I was just at Harvard, and they're lamenting the loss of this massive income stream because they kind of trained up the Chinese Communist Party at the Kennedy School. Sorry, I'm not supposed to say it out loud, but so again, they had been like going overseas and training people in these ways. And then the question is, are there other countries that they're interested in their ways of doing things, their growth stories, and so on? I mean, right now, it seems to be particularly interesting is you see countries wanting to learn from China. And that seems to be the story, which is the Europeans are all wanting to get their hands on Chinese technology in this kind of fabulous shift of technology flows. But anyway, that's how I would frame that. And I certainly don't know the answer, but I think there's a skeptical view, again, kind of the Olsonian politics and political economy getting more sclerotic, as opposed to that there is a more optimistic view about the adaptiveness of the Chinese Communist Party. Like Jonathan Zinn at Brookings talks about, like, this regime has really learned a lot from the past, from past mistakes, from past policies, and it tends to quickly pivot if it feels like it's going the wrong direction. And so there is a more optimistic view about that. Yes.
I'm Shifeng, a doctoral student here. I'm wondering, in your opinion, how does the recent technological innovation tell us about the state-society relationship in the private sector? So like several years ago, when Xi Jinping cracked down the big tech company, people used to think that because he, unlike his predecessor, is a hardliner communist, so of course he's more anti-business, right? But most, or I should say all recent technology innovation are from private companies in China. So I guess there are something more complicated than anti-business and pro-business bloc. So what's your opinion?
So yeah, if Xi Jinping or the party are anti-business, this is a big problem for them, because as you say, the private sector is what's generating the vast majority of innovation in China. So I think what we're seeing is Xi Jinping learning that he has to depend on the private sector and trying and experimenting with ways to do that. And I guess the reverse of that is the private sector also adapting to the need to operate in that kind of an environment. So this is the kind of argument that leads people to say that's a very challenging thing. It's a very politically fraught thing. Under, you know, and they would say under Xi Jinping, or if he gets more repressive, or they would say he's going to come down too heavily, right? And then he's going to tamp out innovation by doing that. So I think typically when scholars look at that, they're pretty pessimistic that that can work. Again, we've seen success in the past several years, but I don't know. Again, scholars would generally be pretty skeptical of that enduring, particularly if, as we're seeing, I think scholars were more, as Bruce was getting to before, were more optimistic about a more pluralistic Chinese Communist Party being able to navigate that as opposed to that more concentrated, centralized. So for that, there's a lot of skepticism about precisely navigating this. Then from the standpoint of my book, I would say we have seen China get to a place that in this view, it should never have gotten there, right? So already they have surprised us, and they may surprise us again.
One more.
Okay, Nick.
Thank you. I'm Nick Anderson. I'm a professor here at the Elliott School. Congrats, Jenny. My question is about how narrow or broad you think the path is to smart authoritarianism. So it struck me, like, in your mechanisms of smart authoritarianism, all of these are quite risky for the leaders involved. If they go too far in one direction or the other, they either get overthrown or they get stagnation. And so, like, I guess the reason I'm asking is that if the path is very narrow and China sort of, managed to sneak through because of, able leadership or luck, then the critics might still be correct, but they just got China wrong for sort of idiosyncratic reasons. Whereas if you think the path is broad, it's actually much wider than we thought. And actually growing as an autocrat is easier than literature thought, then your critique is stronger of, what the other, the critics get wrong. I'm just curious what you think, like, is this a model that's easy to copy or you could see happening in other countries?
Yeah, I love this question. Yeah, I would say I don't think I have a good answer to it right now. I think that the path was actually a little broader than we thought, because we had in the literature, we have this very kind of pro or Western bias in the sense of economic development and what that looks like and what causes it. And so we had a narrower view that says you have to do these things, and that will lead to economic development. And I think that what my work shows, very much similar to like Wenwen Ong, she talks about both the China model and then also other countries' developmental paths with kind of like much more kind of localized innovation, and just poor countries just kind of figure out ways of doing things, even if it doesn't conform to the Western model. I think that we tended to look for, are they doing it our way? In which case, if they weren't, we would say, oh, well, this isn't going to work. So actually, I think there is a broader path because we had this overly narrow view of what they had to do. I mean, one thing that I've just been exposed to in the course of this research, for example, like the property rights dimensions is really fascinating. And everybody agrees on the basic insight, which is you have to incentivize entrepreneurs and inventors. So that's what we need to do. But then the way that you do that can be really different, right? So, you could give prizes, for example, like the Longitude Prize in England, hundreds of years ago. The Soviets would give like cash bonuses and these kinds of things. So again, they're not patents. They're not royalties. They're different, right? So we think of property rights as a patent, just almost reflexively. That's not the case, right? It's what is that function that we need to perform? It's the function of rewarding people for taking risks. And so the way that you do that can be extraordinarily different. And my understanding of the Chinese case, and I'm definitely not an expert on this dimension, but the property rights story is really confusing and really interesting. And China did not do it remotely the Western way. And so it was much more at the provincial level and provincial competition with one another and so on. And so again, given how there's clearly lots of more ways to do this than we understood, I think actually the path to this was broader than we thought. We'll stop there.
Okay, good. Well, it's been a fascinating both talk and engaging give and take with the crowd. So we look forward to having you back for your next book next year, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Now, please join me in thanking Jenny.